violence and bloodshed. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was primarily caused by invading Germanic barbarians and their violent seizure of power. This happened during the 5th century. The barbarians invaded the empire, not out of bitterness toward Rome, but because they envied her abundant material wealth. These invasions would lead to the dismemberment of the empire and shrinkage of the tax base, a devastating blow to the power and prestige of Rome. Without an adequate tax base, it became difficult for Rome to maintain professional armies. Historian Peter Brown would have you believe these invasions were really a peaceful accommodation between Romans and barbarians. This would have come as a surprise to the people directly affected by the chaos. The reality is the invasions were largely unpleasant and disruptive for those who lived through them. When Rome was besieged by the Goths in 410, the Romans turned to cannibalism to avoid starvation. The violence and devastation of barbarian conquest affected all areas of the empire, some more than others. In Gaul, the violence lasted for almost a century, only ending with the replacement of the imperial government with Burundian and Frankish kingdoms by the 6th century. Most of the empire was affected. The Dark Ages were not an isolated phenomenon, they affected most areas of the Roman Empire. However, not everywhere experienced decline at the same time or witnessed similar levels of decline. North Africa, North and Central Italy and Britain were in decline centuries before the Aegean world. In the case of Britain, the decline was particularly drastic. The Romano-Celtic civilization that had once flourished on the island virtually disappeared, returning its inhabitants to a prehistoric level of existence. By the 7th century, all territories formerly under imperial administration, with the exception of Constantinople and the Levant, which continued to flourish under Arab Muslim rule, had experienced calamitous decline. The decline of economic complexity. The disappearance of considerable economic complexity, which resulted in the end of prosperity across the empire, is powerful evidence of widespread decline. This was the sophistication of Roman manufacture and distribution of high-quality goods, which had benefited most of the empire's inhabitants. During the 5th century, political infighting among Romans and barbarian invasion had virtually destroyed regional economies, putting an end to complexity. The disappearance of complexity was by no means uniform, there is some inter-regional variation. By 400 AD, this economic complexity had begun to recede in the West. By 600, the eastern Mediterranean was affected, with the exception of the Levant. Britain had experienced the most drastic decline in terms of economic complexity, sinking below the level of the pre-Roman Iron Age. Europe was not to see the same level of material sophistication that had existed in Roman times until sometime between the 13th and 15th centuries, the period otherwise known as the Late Middle Ages. The decline of pottery. The most abundant evidence of Roman decline comes from study of pottery. There are 3 features of this pottery that were not to return again to the West until centuries later. These are its excellent quality and standardization, its production in massive quantities and its widespread geographical diffusion. High-quality Roman pottery was not only found among the rich, but also among the poor. By the post-Roman period, these 3 features were no longer in evidence. All sophistication in the production and trading of pottery receded, virtually disappearing in Britain and parts of Spain. The overall quality of Roman pottery had declined, becoming more basic and impractical. The amount of pottery in circulation had decreased substantially and its geographical distribution from the great manufacturing centers, such as those of Roman North Africa, became increasingly restricted. The decline of monumental building. Additional evidence of Roman decline comes from the study of housing. During Roman times, even the humblest dwellings were made of mortared stone and brick and had tiled roofing. In both urban and rural areas, houses with marble and mosaic flooring, underfloor heating and piped water were ubiquitous. In the post-Roman Mediterranean region, use of stone and brick to build dwellings had declined significantly. Most domestic housing was largely made of perishable materials, timber walls, dirt floors and thatched roofing. Brian Ward Perkins tells us all new buildings constructed during the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain were made of perishable materials. The church and monasteries of Jarrow and Monkwearmouth, built towards the end of the 7th century, are among the first stone structures in England since the Roman period. To build these structures, the Northumbrian abbot Benedict Bioscope had to import artisans from Gaul because there was no one in Britain trained in masonry and glazing. The Venerable Bede, 673-735, writes, "After the interval of a year, Benedict crossed the sea into Gaul, and no sooner asked than he obtained and carried back with him some masons to build him a church in the Roman style, which he had always admired. When the work was drawing to completion, he sent messengers to Gaul to fetch makers of glass, more properly artificers, who were at this time unknown in Britain, that they might glaze the windows of his church, with the cloisters and dining rooms. This was done, and they came, and not only finished the work required, but taught the English nation their handicraft. All other things necessary for the service of the church and the altar, the sacred vessels, and the vestments, because they could not be procured in England, he took especial care to buy and bring home from foreign parts." Brian Ward Perkins tells us that in post-Roman Italy, only kings and bishops continued to enjoy a Roman-level standard of living in terms of housing.